25 years from now, I might not be here. And it has the potential to cause a lot of questioning of how am I living my life right now?
Your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability, and you get to choose. This is the Building Psychological Strength podcast, where we explore ways to build resilience, build confidence, and make our minds work in our favor. We draw from the fields of psychology and life design to help us intentionally create a rock-solid mindset upon which a vibrant life experience can be built. My name is April Seifert. I'm a psychologist, a life design strategist, and co-founder of Peak Mind, the Center for Psychological Strength. Each week, I'll introduce you to an expert, a concept, a technique, or a hands-on practice that will help you build psychological strength in your own life. These are the tools to help you thrive. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Building Psychological Strength podcast. My name is April Seifert and I'm your host. This week you are meeting a woman by the name of Megan Betterman. Megan does some really interesting work. She kind of has a left brain, right brain thing going on with the work that she does. On one side of the coin, she is a leader in a large organization. She has an MBA. She's got that whole logical left brain side of the coin covered. On the other side, though, she also incorporates a lot of holistic wellness practices in the work that she does. Specifically, she is a lifestyle and wellness consultant based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She is a registered yoga instructor and a certified gyrotonic trainer. And she leads these incredible workshops where she combines things like yoga to start the workshop off, yoga followed by a visioning exercise, followed by starting to chart a course into what the future of your life might look like. There's a lot of elements of what we would consider life design in these workshops that she does. So today, I was really excited to bring her on this episode of the podcast because Megan is so great at giving you practical ways to incorporate things like visioning, things like mindfulness, and things like yoga into your everyday life. And that's something that I think a lot of us struggle with, is figuring out how to fit all of these things into our busy lives when it feels like they require so much time and so many special circumstances in order to make them happen. So Megan's really great at that. She's also really great at breaking down the benefits and the reasons why some of these things are so important. So in particular, we have a great discussion about yoga. She has this amazing perspective about yoga as a wellness practice, meaning like as an exercise, so a physical exercise, versus the side of yoga that we don't talk about as often, especially, in Western culture. We don't talk about the side of yoga that really comes with easing our mind and clearing our mind and getting really centered and really grounded. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about in the mindfulness space, so much of it can be achieved through yoga. And yoga as a practice to set you up for things like meditation. This is just a really great conversation to shed more light on some of these practices that I think we kind of throw them around in mainstream, media and just as we talk about them in the wellness space, but we don't really take the time to get a deep understanding of the reasons why they are so impactful in our lives. We also have this fun conversation about the idea of visioning, which there's a lot of, discussion out there in, the self-help and personal development space about things that are all, woo, right? Things like the law of attraction and stuff like that. I give a little bit of a perspective on what something like visioning looks like from a cognitive psych perspective, and can it coexist in this space between cognitive psychology and what we would consider sort of woo culture. So it's a really fun interview. There's a lot in here. Megan gives some really great practical tips about how to incorporate mindfulness in your everyday life. She is just masterful at that. And so I'm really excited for you all to meet Megan Betterman. Megan, this has been a long time coming, and I'm so thrilled that you're finally on the podcast with me. This is great. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, April.
So we met actually oh gosh, was it a year ago, maybe or so? We were in the same mastermind working on passion projects, which it's fun because this podcast has been enveloped into that passion project that I was working on. And we get to talk about today some of the work that has evolved out of the work that you were doing in that mastermind. So I'm so pumped because I know the wealth of information that you have to share with everybody. This is great.
Yep. Thank you. Yep. I think we started last October, September with Yasna. So it's been about a year.
Yay. Love it. Okay. So I gave everybody a little bit of an overview on you and the work you do and that type of thing. But you and I, before we hopped on to record, you had an interesting reason and almost trigger as to how you got into doing some of this work. I'm wondering if we can start there, and I'm sort of jumping right in, but it's a commonality that you and I share that I think is an interesting place to start because, you know, the most random life events can take us down these paths that end up being things that we're really passionate about. So I'm hoping you can share a little bit about that and how you got into this work.
Sure. So to give an overview quickly, I have a full-time role with Health Partners as a leader of our digital teams. And then I also, on the side of that, have a huge passion for health and wellness. And that came out of some health issues that I actually had starting when I was even an adolescent and evolved into finding out it was a digestive disease. And through my late teens and early 20s, I was trying to figure out, what is this? How can I live a better and more vibrant life? And right after college, I started to practice yoga, and I started to realize, wow, there's much more here than simply the physical practice. There's an emotional, there's a spiritual component that, quite frankly, I didn't realize was there. And starting that ended up helping my symptoms quite a bit and helping me to start uncovering other pathways into healing. So I started a pretty big deep dive into nutrition, into acupuncture, into energy medicine in general. And that started to open up this possibility of, oh, could I do some of these things to help other people live a more vibrant life? And ended up doing yoga teacher training, which then led into other certifications that I've done since then. But really now I offer workshops that incorporate yoga, mindfulness, and visioning all into one experience for people to understand how they can connect deeply to their own selves and start to living a more vibrant, resilient, and grounded life. So it's been a little bit of a journey through challenging times that have led me into a world that I would have not known existed otherwise. So that's a short version of how I've gotten to where I am. And I love that you and I share this health issue. Not that I don't love that we have health issues, but I love that both of us are strong and resilient in the face of these fairly substantial chronic diseases and can be an example for others on how can we live more vibrantly. So I'm excited to talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I talk about a lot on the podcast is for folks who this might be your first episode. I was diagnosed with MS when I was 14-ish and have been living with it ever since. And, you know, I spoke about this on a recent episode with Isaac Lidsky as well. And, you know, when you initially get diagnosed with something, and I don't know, Megan, if your experience was similar to this, but when you initially get diagnosed with something, and this is probably the case for any big, major, unexpected, potentially traumatic life event, when it happens, your mind instantly goes to work and starts telling you stories about what it thinks the outcome is going to be. And they're rarely good. Like, we typically panic in those situations, and our mind conjures up basically the worst case scenario and chucks that at us consistently. And that was the case for me. Did that happen to you?
Absolutely. And it was really disconcerting because for a long time, I didn't really know what it was, and being told it's this or it's that or it's not a big deal. And that was the hardest thing for me, was being told it's nothing, it's in your head, when I very clearly knew in my deepest part of myself, this is not something I'm making up. It's not some sort of anxiety response. There is something physically not right. So I ended up having to become really an advocate for my own self and saying, nope, I want these tests done. I'm pretty sure you're going to find something. And sure enough, they did. So yes, my worst case scenarios were substantial, and it's actually kind of freeing to know what it is. I don't know if you felt that, but like once you actually know, you can then move forward. Without the knowing, it's more uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. When I was being diagnosed, I was quote unquote too young to have MS. Now, part of it is that they weren't really looking for MS in kids that young, and now a lot of kids that young have it. But they looked for everything else. And so for a while there, we were flirting with diagnoses like, I have a brain tumor. And maybe it's Lyme disease, maybe it's a virus. Like it could have been any number of things that were relatively benign up to things that were potentially, could kill me. And so knowing what it was, it sort of hit the middle, right? It's not something that's benign and is going to go away. It's also not something that's likely to kill me or anytime soon. So, what do I do with this now? And how do I move forward and what's it going to look like? So yeah, there was a lot with that. So you mentioned you sort of pointed in the direction of wanting to understand how you could live better. Were there particular things you were seeking? Was it, I want to physically feel better? Was it psychologically, I want to be more calm and resilient about this? What were the things you were seeking when you pivoted in that direction?
It was definitely physically feeling better. And I recall yoga and nutrition being the first things I went after. And then yoga is a little bit of a gateway into meditation because, when you think about the origins of yoga and meditation, yoga was meant to be the preparation before your mind is ready to meditate. So I found myself in more and more experiences of meditation, and I realized that there's a physical benefit, but there's also a huge mental benefit. So that's a little bit how I started journeying in. So I would say it started physical and then started to pivot more into emotional, psychological, and spiritual over time. And as I started delving deeper and deeper into different modalities, different practices. So that was really, really where it began. I remember making some recipes out of a particular cookbook. I didn't know how to cook right when I started delving into this. And my family will tell you I've had some pretty funny cooking snafus over time, but I've become a pretty fantastic cook over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years. And that was really the big thing was, how can I feel physically better with a digestive disease? So that was my entry point in.
And it's interesting too, something that Ashley and I talk about a lot is out in media and other places, you tend to hear about physical health, sharp distinction, or mental health. And it's a really dumb distinction to make because the crossover between them is so incredible that it's difficult to impact one without the other one being impacted. You think about something as simple as we all know that the more regularly you exercise, it reduces stress, it reduces feelings of depression, like all of these pieces. It's the simplest example. Another simple example of being under chronic stress and that adrenaline and then cortisol release can impact your likelihood of having heart problems and cardiovascular problems. There's such a big linkage between them that as soon as you start, and it sounds like you've delved into this and started to realize how intertwined they are, when you see that, it almost seems silly that you would have thought they were separate things before.
Oh, absolutely. They're so incredibly connected. It's very clear. And I think specifically with digestive diseases, they typically do find that there's a higher rate of anxiety, depression, et cetera, that come in concert with digestive diseases. There's a connection there that I think is really fascinating. And so the better I've felt physically, which is not always the case. Sometimes I go through periods even recently of flares or what have you, but I notice that when I'm physically feeling great, I'm usually mentally feeling great. And if one's off digestively, it's harder to feel mentally great. So I absolutely see a linkage there now and work on it regularly through the different practices that I've cultivated.
Mm-hmm. And now you're starting to, and this is kind of coming full circle because you're starting to teach other people almost how to use these practices in this holistic way in order to make meaningful impacts both psychologically for them, but then also in their lives. Can you tell us a little bit? You mentioned it earlier and we kind of flirted with it, but I'd love to go there next with these workshops that you're leading and the components that you've added in, because it's very intentional how you've set them up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So it is intentional in how I've set them up. And I decided to pull a few of my favorite things into one because what I notice is a lot of workshops will have one particular focus. Like, for example, you might go to a yoga workshop that's a couple of hours, but there's rarely a workshop that brings together yoga, mindfulness, visioning into one experience. So the reason I did that is I think they're powerful practices that I use in my own life every day to feel more vibrant, more grounded, like I mentioned. So the yoga part, it starts with typically either yin or gentle yoga. I exchange them depending on the group. which yin is, for example, you're holding a pose for a period of minutes. You might be in a yoga posture for 5 minutes, and that over time gets your brain really calm after doing several of those for several minutes. And that yoga part basically gets the mind prepared for the mindfulness exercise. So we move into that, which is a powerful visualization where it's more of a mindfulness experience where someone might visualize themselves 20 to 25 years from now and what that future self would be telling the current self, which you and I actually did something similar that you led in our mastermind group. It's not very dissimilar from that, but it basically helps people figure out, how do I want to be then? And what do I need to do now to make sure I end up being the woman then that I'm seeking? That usually is a really powerful experience for people. It usually brings up a lot of emotion, especially people who might be later in life and they realize 25 years from now, I might not be here. And it has the potential to cause a lot of questioning of how am I living my life right now? And the beautiful thing about that is the next section, visioning, is all about how do I want to feel? How do I want my relationships to be? What is my career feeling like? As opposed to, I want this house, I want this car. It's not that. It's not law of attraction. I'm seeking this particular thing. It's more about, in general, what are the feelings I want to feel? What are the relationships I want to cultivate? What is the purpose in life that I want to bring forth? And I lead people through a series of questions and answering to then bring you to a place where you can write out, I am X, I am Y, I cultivate X, Y, and Z. And it leads them into actually writing down their vision in a beautiful note card that then can be taken forward. Because, you go to a workshop and you have like that little packet of 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, and you come home and you stuff it in a drawer. And I thought, well, why can't I create something people will want to display? So it's a beautiful card where you write your vision and then can display it for the future and read it. I try to read mine every couple of days and remind myself, here's what my vision is. Am I living my vision, or have I strayed from my vision? So those three elements of the yoga, the mindfulness, and the visioning all come together to form a little bit of a mini retreat for people to really delve deeper into self-discovery and what types of things do I need to bring forward in my life and what types of things might I let go. So that's really what the workshops have been. I've led 2 so far this year, and I have a third one coming up on November 3rd, actually, and have had just wonderful response from them. So I'll continue to lead those into the future and love bringing these different elements together.
It's such a great combination. When I think about even the first two pieces, the yoga and the mindfulness and the visioning aspect of it, that more meditative aspect of it, we talk a lot about this in Peak Mind. We do a lot with it in the membership around using those two practices as a way of like training your mind to, you're trying to separate the constant chatter that's happening in your brain, like the constant noise and the constant just information overload that your mind naturally sends you every minute of the day. You're trying to separate you, the person, from that voice, because that voice isn't you. That voice is just something that your mind has evolved to do on its own. And the more you can separate from that, and the more you can, in certain circumstances, quiet it so that you can really focus on who you are as the human, again, which is not this voice. You are not that voice. People experience such incredible outcomes from being able to do that, because the joke that we make, Ashley and I say this to each other all the time, you don't have to believe every thought that you think, because those thoughts, they're just thoughts. They're just things that happened. You don't have to actually go down the rabbit hole with them. So just simply those first two aspects of this, helping people become more mindful, which just means be here in the present moment instead of, chasing every thought that your brain throws at you. It's such an incredible practice to help people cultivate.
It really is. And I would say too that a lot of yoga practices in the US or other parts of the Europe, et cetera, the practice has become more about a workout. And yoga obviously does have physical benefits. However, it's really designed for the mind. And I think that gets overlooked quite often, especially the way that classes and studios are typically set up. But when you flip that script a little bit and realize, oh my gosh, this practice actually helps my mind feel much clearer, because that's what it is intended to do from its origin. it's a really different practice. And when we approach it from that lens, as opposed to this is a workout, I think that's when the benefits come alive for yoga.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? That is a misconception right there. And it's one where I feel like I don't completely understand it. I've done some yoga. I would not consider myself a practitioner of yoga. Can you talk a little bit more about that connection to the mind and it being more than just a way to get really flexible? I mean, it seems like that's what people focus on, like, oh, you get really flexible. But there's more there to it, and I'd love to hear that from you.
Sure. I agree. It's a misconception. And I'll go back to what I was starting to touch on earlier, which is yoga was designed to prepare the mind for meditation. So the way that I experience it, and I can't speak for everyone, is that going through a series of postures called asana in yoga is creating this focus that happens where you're starting to focus inward inside the body of what's happening, how am I feeling? I'm focusing more on the sensation as opposed to what is on my to-do list, although those thoughts do come up on what is my to-do list, but that's the practice of how do you come back to what you're experiencing in the body. And over time, let's say an hour or 90-minute class, you're starting to get deeper and deeper into these postures and the focus of the practice. And what that allows the body to do is then to say, okay, I'm just experiencing this. My mind slowly is getting more and more and more clear so that by the time I'm ready to sit and do a meditation, it's very easy to come into, for me, I come into a mantra practice where it's the repeating of the same word over and over is my typical meditation practice. But if I haven't done the movement and the yoga to get myself there, my mind will still be very chatty with me. And what I observe after the 60 to 90 minutes is that it's so much easier for me to go into that meditative spot because I've started to get into this focus pattern. It's actually similar to what you mentioned with the psychological strength. I'm basically like winnowing down all of the chatter because I'm focusing on my body and something else so that I'm finally ready to sit. And I find this happen anytime I teach this workshop or any other yoga class. By the time people are at the end of a yoga class, they are so calm and blissful. And that's really what when the mind is ready to meditate. And the unfortunate thing about a lot of yoga classes here is that you finish the class and then you get up and you go after Shavasana. But really what should happen is we finish our Shavasana and then we sit for another 20, 30 minutes of meditation because that's when we are most ready to do it. So that's why I connect these things together, is because I can't ever really find that in a typical class that I go to. So that's a little bit of my experience of it, but it is a misconception, one I'd love to break, but it really is about the mind versus the body.
Life can be so much more than simply going to work and waiting for the weekend. But deep down, you already know that. You know that life can be so much more vibrant. You know you were made for more than just passively going through the motions. You know you can thrive, but to do that, you have to start from the inside out. And that is why I'm so excited to announce that for a limited time, we're offering you the opportunity to join us in the Peak Mind membership for only $1 for your first month. That's right, $1 to join us in the full Peak Mind membership. All you have to do to take advantage of this amazing offer is to visit us at www.peakmindpsychology.com, click on the membership, and enter the code THRIVE at checkout. Think about it. We all know what we need to do to keep our bodies strong. But what about our minds? What if you had the tools to build the psychological strength, confidence, and resilience to help you thrive at work, at home, and in the rest of your life? What if you made the commitment to living your life by design and not by default? All of this is possible. The goal of Peak Mind, the Center for Psychological Strength, is to help you build the mental toughness, flexibility, and resilience to thrive in your life. We draw from the fields of psychology and life design to help you intentionally create the vibrant life experience you know is possible. Through live online workshops, a 24/7 on-demand library, expert interviews, and monthly challenges, our members are building the psychological strength that it takes to thrive through life's ups and downs. And like I said, you can do it too. For a limited time, we're offering you the opportunity to join us for only $1 for your first month. Just visit www.peakmindpsychology.com, click on the membership, and enter the code THRIVE at checkout. Your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability, and you get to choose. So what choice are you making? Join us in the Peak Mind membership before this amazing offer goes away. And I think that too helps people give themselves a little bit of grace, that if they have tried a meditation practice and they find it extremely difficult to sit there, they're finding it extremely difficult to come back to the present moment and feel like they're getting as much out of it as they want to, just know that, in the way that you describe it, it would be really hard, even for like a monk, to meditate in that way without this preparatory exercise of yoga beforehand. Like, it sounds like this is just a human thing. This would be hard to do without a little bit of preparation.
Right. And I would say my current morning routine, which has never been always this way, but over the last 10 years or so has really evolved. I start my day with water and hydration and then move into yoga and a meditation. But I find that those things in sequence really help me. I can, when I first started meditating, I would hold myself to 2 minutes a day. And I think for anyone who's curious of, I want to start this, but I don't really know how, that's where I started, was a really small increment of time. And over the course of time, that ended up increasing and increasing. Usually I do closer to 20 at this point, or even a guided one's a nice way in through an app I love, which is called Insight Timer. I recommend that to anyone who's looking to get into meditation. But starting small is the key, because I think it's really overwhelming to try and add a habit that's going to build that psychological strength, going from nothing to something substantial. So how can we find a little experiment that's short into our days, something that I've personally done, that then grow into much bigger habits that now feel like brushing my teeth. So I would recommend that.
I love that. And I love the sort of wading into the pool and just being realistic in the beginning, starting with something small and then working your way up. You look at the science of habit change, and it's never a good idea to just, not never, it's rarely, and it's a lot more difficult if you go the route of just ripping off a really big Band-Aid and thinking that you're going to make a lasting change. So I love that that's the approach you take.
Yeah, that's a recipe for falling back into the old habit very quickly. And even from a behavior change standpoint, it can take years for a habit to truly stick. I think there's a myth out there about 3 weeks, and I don't know how you feel about that, but that always irritated me, because in my own life, trying to get rid of sugar or to start adding meditation or drinking more water, it can take years, and sometimes those patterns still come back up. So the 3 weeks always makes me laugh a little bit.
Oh man, I'll link it up in your show notes page. I believe it's called Well-Designed Life. It is,
yes,
a woman wrote it. Right. It's not designing your life. It's not the Stanford guys. It's and she talks so much about how long it takes, right? Like, there's this misconception, like it takes at least 30 days of blah, blah, blah for it to become a habit. It's so much longer than that, because what she's done is studied at what point does that, like the neuroplasticity side of it, at what point do those neurons that you are interconnecting by trying to do something new, at what point does that new pathway become myelinated? Meaning it runs automatically in a smooth way and you don't have to work as hard at it. And it's like years. It takes a long time.
You know what I liked about that book? I read it too a couple of years ago, is that she gives it in like a really nice analogy of a baby wolf and an adult wolf.
Yes, tell that. That's so good.
So her analogy is that the adult wolf is your existing habit, and the baby wolf is the new habit you're trying to bring to fruition. And she talks about how the baby wolf will try and grow and grow and overcome the adult wolf, and that the adult wolf will inevitably keep overpowering the baby wolf for years and years, until the baby wolf keeps growing and growing and growing up to being equal with the adult wolf. And then you have some semblance of a chance of that habit sticking. And to your point, the myelination of the neuroplasticity idea of the brain is now wired to actually go toward what the baby wolf is bringing forth. And I love that idea, because it does take so long. For me, I think it's years. Probably 7 to 10 for big habits to change. So I think about the baby wolf a lot when I'm trying to bring a new habit to life. Is there anything you would add into that of how she describes the baby and the adult wolf?
No, that was beautiful. And it's just another way to just give yourself a little bit of grace, not to let yourself off the hook, but to understand that it's hard because it's hard. It's not hard because you're weak or not trying hard in some way. It's hard because it's just a difficult thing to do. The other cool thing that I remember her saying is when you're introducing a new habit, lots of people think, okay, I'm going to stop drinking wine or any alcohol during the week. No more. I'm not doing it. And then they go for a little while and then they have a glass of wine and they're like, oh God, I fell off the wagon. Oh man, I can't do it. What they pay attention to is when they had a drink. What they don't pay attention to is how long was the gap between the last time you had a drink. Okay, great. Now start again the next day. Like you're back on the plan. So you screwed up once. Big deal. Start again. How long is the gap the next time? Because what she finds is that on average, don't get too specific, but like on average, those gaps continually widen as you're working on the habit intentionally more and more. So yes, you will fall off the wagon potentially dozens of times, but what you're looking for is, are you able to hold it a little bit longer each time on average? And I just love that because it's so realistic about habit change versus having people wag their finger and beat themselves up because they couldn't just change something overnight.
Mm-hmm. I also like in that too, where she also talks about not only the gap in between, but keep going as opposed to, oh, okay, so I've had the glass of wine and now I'm done with that experimentation. It's a continuous experimentation. And I love how she talked about that too, because it can get discouraging of when you've gone, for example, I have so Insight Timer, the meditation app I use, I had like 122 days in a row of tracking it. I had been meditating daily since before then, but I hadn't like logged it in the app. And I missed one day because I did a meditation during acupuncture and I didn't have the app on. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just broke such a long streak. But then I thought, well, the habit is more important than tracking it here. But it's one of those things where the next day I started again and now I'm at maybe day 22. But it's one of those tracking things I like to do and made me think of that, getting back into it, even if you feel like you fell off.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about that third component of your workshop too. You mentioned visioning, and it's cool because there's so much at play here. And just truth be told, folks listening to this, we were chatting and just geeking out about this before we started recording already. So we're primed and really pumped to have this conversation. But there's a lot of components that come into play with something like visioning, where you're really thinking about, well, I'll let you talk about how you ask people to come up with that statement. Like, what are some of the things, and I'm not asking you to, spill all the beans here, but what are some of the things that people need to really get in touch with for them to be able to write a statement that is powerful in the way that you want it to be during that workshop?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the questions are around, what are your top values? What are the things you hold dearest to you? And, it depends on where people are in their personal development journey. I would call myself, I think you call yourself a life experience junkie. I am a personal development junkie and have been for a really long time. And, some people have a very solid sense of, here are my core values, here's what I stand for. And then others are exploring that or thinking about it for the first time. So there's some exploration of that. There's exploration of what are the top feelings you'd like to experience. And they don't always have to be roses and sunshine type of feelings. It can be nuanced. It doesn't have to be a certain type of thing. I give a list of emotions because usually there are three emotions: good, fine, bad, but there are so many more textures. And so I give people an option of, here are a lot of different textures of these different emotions. What are you looking for in your life? I ask people to reflect on their relationships and what type of energy they'd like to bring to those. For example, they might feel like they've really let their friendships lapse. If there might be a new mom and they're feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm so consumed by motherhood and I can't see my friends. Or there might be questions about what kind of spiritual or physical practices are you currently embedding into your life, or what ones might you want to in the future. Things could be other questions on career, of what do you see as your highest purpose in life, and are you actively doing that work in the world? So it's a lot of provocative questions about relationships, career, emotions, I would say, that then lead people into the I am statements. So it's a little bit like a Mad Lib at the end, that I am, I bring, that type of thing, to get to that final statement. So it's a series of those self-discovery questions on those main topics.
And what's cool about that too is it mimics so nicely over onto the process that I teach when I run Life Design Lab. Life Design Lab isn't about necessarily uncovering that personal visioning statement, but it's around, how do you want, like the process you just described is one of the key processes that we go through in the beginning of that program, because you have to get to know the person at the center of whatever it is you're trying to design. And this goes for if you're trying to design the next hottest Instant Pot, you have to understand the people who are going to be using it intimately well. Like, what do they adore? What do they hate? What are their barriers? What brings them joy? Like, you have to understand them extremely well in order to design for them. And the same way goes with life design. You have to understand yourself, because you are the only one at the center of your life. And the interesting thing about values, and what I tell people too, is do not, like, you are wasting your time if you just knee-jerk write down the values that you think other people expect you to have. So if you wrote down family, and you wrote it down because you feel like other people expect you to have that, it's not going to work for you. Like, what are the actual things, like the actual pieces that you truly value that you want to pivot this next direction of your life toward? And so that honesty and self-awareness piece is so big to actually making this stuff work.
Absolutely. And to your point, yes, those are very common lists of values, and yes, they might match up or not. An example of one from my vision statement is about spontaneity, because I am not naturally a spontaneous person, but I want to be. So in my vision, I talk about how I am loving, spontaneous, grounded, content. And I read that to myself, remind myself when invitations come my way, how can I say yes? Or how can I be less planful and more going with the flow? And so the values can be different than the typical ones. It can be something a little bit more granular about how you want life to feel, as opposed to more of that umbrella family term, as an example.
Mm-hmm. And the reason why I love this as a practice, and this was something else we chatted about before we started recording. I love this as a practice for one reason is your mind is really good at goal seeking. Like, it's extremely good. If I could name kind of an obscure car, maybe like a dark gray Tesla. And if you haven't been looking for or thinking about a dark gray Tesla before that, if you implant that thought in your mind, like, dark gray Tesla, that's weird, you'll start to notice them in the world around you. It's not that they just showed up there. It's that they were there before. You just didn't have the right lens on your mind. It wasn't looking for that for you. And the cool thing about visioning and about getting so specific and clear and getting a really well-described target is that your mind will go to work for you. It'll find things that are congruent with whatever that statement is that you've written out. It's going to find you people who are similar to that and opportunities that are similar to that. And again, it's not like that person wasn't there necessarily, or they just poof materialized in the world because you wrote this statement down, but it's that your mind didn't know to pay more attention to them, that person versus someone next to them. It just didn't know you had this goal. So getting super clear on it, you're actually putting, we talk about in Peak Mind, your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability. This is one way to turn it into an asset. It's good at goal seeking. So give it a goal, like give it an intentional good goal to chase after, and it'll start to work for you.
Absolutely. And I think the reverse is true. When we're focusing on the negative or what's not working, we'll attract more of that. This gets into my more woo side of law of attraction, which I haven't studied law of attraction deeply. I know what it is from a high level, but I do find that when I'm looking for small moments of serenity, peacefulness, joy during my day, I find them. For example, like a butterfly might just fly by my face, and I'm like, wow, that was gorgeous. Or this day is rainy, yes, but I still think it's beautiful to go on a walk in the rain, as opposed to, oh my gosh, this day is really crappy. I definitely can't do anything fun today. I think the goal seeking too that you're talking about, the way we frame our perspective every day matters. And I've learned that the hard way over the last many years, but I'm trying to be much more looking for the positive in my day. And I find that I do. The goal seeking for positive absolutely works. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, it absolutely, actually, I kind of giggle because the example I give to people all the time is going to the zoo. You go to the zoo And imagine you're standing in front of a habitat. It's one of those, there's trees and vines and maybe some grass and stuff all over the place. And you're looking, there's an animal that's supposed to be in there, and it has a name. It's not like bear or something that but it's an animal whose species you've never really heard of before. If you just saw the name of the animal, you'd have a really hard time looking at that habitat and finding it, because our minds are bad at looking at things. We're really good at looking for things, though. Again, this goal-seeking thing. So the zoo is really smart, and it knows about that. So instead of just telling you what the animal is, it gives you a picture of it. So you can see the picture of the animal, and your mind is extremely good at quickly scanning that habitat that prior to seeing that picture, you would have said, where's the animal? You can instantly find it because your brain's really good at looking for things. So you just have to tell it what to look for. And on the woo side, and this is just me, I'm sure I'll get messages like, April, that's unscientific, or I disagree with you, or whatever. People probably disagree with me. But for me, my biggest goal is that people find practices that they can do that will impact their lives in a meaningful way. Visioning will do that. Now, there's a cognitive psych mechanism through which it works, and that's, this goal-seek mechanism. Whether there are other ones that we can measure or not, I don't know. Maybe there are. Like maybe the law of attraction is the primary way through which this works. I don't know. Either way, I know that this works for people, and so I almost don't care. I just want people to put the practice in place. And if they believe it works through one mechanism through the other, that's okay. As long as their life experiences this shift and this meaningful improvement that I know that they can get out of the practice. And that's kind of where I stand on these things. Like, I don't know. I don't really care as long as they get the benefit from it.
I like that it's open-minded too about possibility. I think I come from more of a scientific or logical side of myself. And I also have this split that's very woo and open to things that cannot be explained. Sometimes it can be difficult to reconcile those things. But to your point, as long as something seems to be happening or we're perceiving some sort of positive change, then I'm okay with it as well. And I'm open to the experience of whatever it might bring.
I love that. So as people are thinking about how to put this stuff into work, this is a great segue, right? Like, let's get practical for people. If you could almost direct people or tell them what to do as they leave this episode, how do people put either the practices of yoga, mindfulness, visioning, any of this into practice in their lives in a way that will lead to a meaningful shift for them? What should people do to get started?
Sure. I think the biggest recommendation I can have that has been the biggest impact for me has been cultivating quiet time in my day where I connect with myself. And for me, that happens to be in the morning. I know that does not work for everyone, but I think it doesn't matter really what you do, if it's prayer, if it's meditation, if it's journaling, but that simple practice, I would say, is the most important. And one idea for action, if you're looking of how do I fill that quiet time, what am I actually doing? A simple practice could be a breath practice, which is not even yoga. It's basically, you can do it when you're sitting in a meeting if you're feeling a little bit less engaged. Is a 4x4x4 breath, which is inhaling for 4 breaths, holding for 4 counts, inhaling for 4 counts, holding for 4 counts, and exhaling for 4 counts. And then you continue that circle of the inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. And what that does is start to bring you much closer into your physical self, much closer into your mental self, much closer to your emotional self, and closer to your spiritual self. And it's a really nice entree into meditation practice, yoga, etc. But it's simpler because you don't have to have on any comfortable clothing. You can do it from anywhere. So I think starting with the breath and that quiet time of cultivating it is the simplest recommendation I can give that will make an actual impact on someone's life.
That's awesome. I think I love that example and that exercise because so many times people sort of pass off or push aside the notion of mindfulness or any of the practices that surround it because you kind of think, oh, maybe I need to go find a beautiful place and I need an hour and a half and it has to be quiet and perfect and uninterrupted and whatever. And that's great. Like if you can get that, do it. But there are enough practices that you can do, as you mentioned, in a meeting. Like you're in meetings, at least once a day, probably a lot of people listening to this, You can do that in a meeting. You can do that driving in your car. Keep your eyes open, but like you can concentrate on your breath driving in your car. You can concentrate on your breath or listen to the sound your feet make when you walk. You can do these simple things that bring you back to the present moment anytime in your life, and it doesn't require a giant commitment of time in a beautiful, perfect, serene place. So I love that example.
Yeah, and I would say to your point about the car, turn off the radio or podcast, whatever, and just drive in silence. That is such an underutilized time of connection because you can do the breath work there. You can just focus on yourself, unless you have, of course, passengers. But a lot of our drive time is solo. If I look around at who's driving around, there's usually one person in the car. So think about how can you use already existing space and time for some of these things. It can be not as hard as we think.
Mm-hmm. What does psychological strength mean to you?
A couple of things come up for me right when I hear that. The phrase mental toughness comes to mind, which was a phrase used in my family of origin quite a bit. Another word that comes up for me is grit. And I think I would call it being comfortable with an uncomfortable part of life, a season, a long stretch of time, knowing that this too shall pass.
That's amazing perspective. That is incredible perspective. Because it's funny, one of the misconceptions, and I talked about it in a prior episode on the podcast, but one of the misconceptions of positive psychology and some of the more, like the newer waves of psychology is that they're telling people to just be happy all the time. And that isn't the case. It's more learning to balance your thinking because your mind will tend to go in a negative, catastrophic direction. It's just how we evolved. So if you can sort of perspective check and right size that feeling, and that's kind of what you're saying, like put this into perspective in terms of what's happening right now. Bad things will happen. You will experience big negative emotions. That's okay. Put it into perspective though, and the context of which it's happening in. So I love that. I love that definition. Where can people find you when they want to learn more? And tell us a little bit about your workshop. Like when is it? Where is it? All of those details.
Oh, sure. I'll start with that. So the next one is the workshop's called Moving Into Your Vision. It's on November 3rd at Modernwell, which I know we share Modernwell as a place where we both do our work. And then it's going to be listed on my website, which is meganbetterman.com. I have a wellness checkup people can find there too. If you go to meganbetterman.com/wellness, there's a downloadable checkup you can do to see how am I doing with my own wellness and where might I find some opportunities for improvement. And then I'm also on Instagram. That's the place where I spend most of my social media time. And you can find me with my name, Megan Betterman, there.
I love that. It has been such a pleasure to chat with you and to learn a little bit more about the work that you have evolved into doing because, you know, it was just great to meet you during Mastermind, but then to have seen what you've built ever since then and just know the impact that these practices can have on people's lives. It's just amazing. So I'm thrilled to have you on. It was great to reconnect and to hear more about what you're doing. We just really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, April. You too.
It's a simple fact that nearly everyone in the world could benefit from building psychological strength. But not everyone will put in the time and effort to do so. But today you did. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Building Psychological Strength. Now, if you're interested in building the mental toughness, confidence, and resilience you need to thrive through life's ups and downs, visit us at www.peakmindpsychology.com. Also, if there's someone in your life who could benefit from this episode, please share it with them. And if you yourself found this episode valuable, meaning if you took away even one insight that you can use to build psychological strength in your own life, we would so appreciate it if you would drop us a rating and a review on iTunes. The thing is, the more ratings and reviews we have, the easier it is to get this powerful and important content out to the people who need to hear it. Remember, your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability, and you get to choose. So choose wisely, my friend. And I'll see you next time on Building Psychological Strength.